Oi, oi, it's your boy, Jack Slack. It's the Jack Slack podcast, and we're coming at you on Monday, the 13th of September. And it was a very, very slow weekend. I was lucky to have other stuff going on outside the fight world to keep me entertained. But basically, all that happened were the geezer fights we talked about on the last episode, on the boycast and on the preview for the non-boys. The Donald Trump headlined card, which also contained Evander Holyfield versus Vitor Belfort and Tito Ortiz versus Anderson Silva. Wouldn't you know it, Anderson Silva is the only person on it who can still box to any degree. Vitor Belfort fought... Well, I mean, he scored his quick knockout, but it was against an Evander Holyfield who was 58 years old. The last of the fighting boomers. Fucking 14-year age difference there. And, you know, as you'd expect, it was fucking gross. Yeah, Evander Holyfield didn't have anything on his punches, which you could see in the pre-fight stuff when he was hitting the mitts. It was very obvious that he didn't have any pop or speed left. So, you know, everyone who was involved in signing this fight, everyone who was involved in training him for this fight and taking a fee, just a bastard who should be ostracized from the sport for life, but won't be, or probably wasn't. I mean, if they took on Evander at this stage, they probably weren't involved in the sport very high up, or probably not training world champions if you're then jumping in to train Evander Holyfield at 58 years old on a week's notice. Like, that's the kind of mismatch that would make MVP blush. Scott Coker would be going, "Oh, are you sure about that?" But mercifully, it was stopped quite quickly and left an awful taste in everyone's mouth. And then they had JDS for some reason and Donald Trump and Jorge Masvidal as like a panel, and then the crowd were just like, "We love Trump, speech." It was as terrible as you'd expect. But the co-main event was the only bit that was really like enjoyable, because Tito Ortiz got starched by Anderson Silva. And honestly, like, people are gonna be like, "Oh, this is the one that proves Anderson Silva's still got something in the tank." But honestly, his Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. performance, we talked about it last week, but it was really impressive. Really impressive. He actually looked like he was taking it seriously. To be honest, more than that, I think he looks like he's enjoying the training and enjoying doing it, but also has something left in the tank to actually learn and adapt and try new things. I'm not, that's not to say that Evander and Tito Ortiz and people like that don't enjoy the training, but it's very clear that Anderson was loving the boxing last time out. And that's what was quite strange about this one, because Tito Ortiz tried to swarm on him quickly, which we said, like, if you're going to do anything as Tito Ortiz, the only advantage you're going to have is that you're probably bigger and stronger, so you might as well try and corner him and try and swing on him quick. And he did, and he utterly failed. And Anderson ducked like 3 flaccid left hooks in a row, came back with a counter right hand, and Tito was done. And I kind of felt sorry for Anderson Silva, who just looked sad that he didn't actually get to box some rounds. But, I mean, Tito Ortiz is such a step down from Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. As much as Chavez Jr. is a failed son and has embarrassed himself numerous times, he's legitimately talented as a boxer, or skilled as a boxer, and not 140 years old. And this is the thing, like, I think there's some joy to be had in this Anderson Silva stuff. Certainly for me, but for others too, I think. And I think the difficulty is in pitching it at the right level, because, yeah, there aren't too many Chavezes out there, Chavez Juniors, who are decently talented, have won a world title, but equally they're not the best of the best, but they've got a name. It's going to be hard to find someone like that again. But you don't want to see Anderson Silva, who clearly still has something in the tank, against these guys who don't have anything to offer him, He did make like overtures to retiring and stuff, but I think he'll probably want to do something else. But yes, I mean, he can basically, he'll find his own opponent for that. I mean, maybe they do Roy Jones, but Roy Jones was he wasn't looking too terrible in the Tyson fight. It was just surprising how scary Tyson looked at like 55. But even the Roy Jones one might be fun. I could see neither of them knocking the other out and doing a lot of dancing and fucking around, which would be fun. Probably a lot of punches thrown, because both guys can go at a decent pace for their age. And of course, you've got like the sort of bromance that they always had. Whereas Vitor Belfort is now calling for $30 million in the Logan Paul fight. It's like, fuck off, Vitor. You absolute monster for taking it. Like, monster in the bad way, not monster in like, oh, what a monster. Like, what a dick to take a fight against a 58-year-old Evander Holyfield and then act like you won the Super Bowl once you knock him out without a single punch thrown on his part. But anyway, otherwise, there is fuck all going on, or was fuck all going on last weekend. So today we're going to do a questions and answers podcast. The Luke Thomas chat rap is what I'm calling it. And at the time of recording, I have threads up on my YouTube community page, my Twitter, and my Facebook. And the questions have poured in, so I'm going to go through them and do some from each. Basil asks, why is female boxing pay super low? Seems like the women get paid much better in MMA. I think that's probably because women are better... they're considered more part of the product in MMA. Until very recently, women's boxing has been like a sideshow. There's a reason that Holly Holm won 8 world titles and never fought outside of Albuquerque. It's like, oh, we've got a pretty girl, we can sell her to the locals, you know? Not to take away from Holly Holm's skill, but like it wasn't a big thing. You got Katie Taylor and some others trying to make it more legit, but no, it's still seen as sort of a sideshow. Whereas women's MMA, for better or worse, because it's clearly, like if you watch a lot of MMA, the standard of women's MMA is generally lower, but it's being presented alongside men's MMA in the biggest organization in the world, so it's much more accepted as part of it, whereas you pretty much have to go out of your way to care about women's boxing, or you certainly would in the past. It's Not Cage Fighting, who has a successful YouTube channel, asks, should there be fixed rules regarding interim titles? I.e., if a champion hasn't been booked to fight in over a year, a reason people hate them is the inconsistency. One gets created 4 months after a champion wins, yet other champs go 2 or 3 years, go 2 years without defending, and zilch. I think we all know that the interim title exists purely for the UFC. Nobody else benefits from an interim title. There's a very rare case when like Dominic Cruz is out for 2 years and Renan Barão's beating killers, and you're like, I think we'd probably deserve to call Renan Barão the best in the world because Dominic Cruz isn't here. Those are like the examples when yes, you probably do need, and it's the sort of in between time when there's a chance Dominic Cruz will come back that the interim title is important. Otherwise, interim titles, they only exist for bollocks reasons. They've only ever existed in boxing for bollocks reasons. The interim title exists so that if the UFC needs to run a pay-per-view with enough title fights on, they can make up another title and have a fight that was just okay suddenly be on the poster as a title fight. The other reason it exists is so that you can threaten people, because if Francis Ngannou doesn't fight quick enough, this interim title now becomes a real title. So adding fixed rules to it would only hurt the purpose of it. The way to get fixed rules added to it would be if there was a fighters union or a players association. They would say, we need fixed rules on these interim titles, and they'd say we also need fixed rules on the rankings, because you can't use those like organization-wide tools or measurements or assessments of someone's skill to like manipulate someone in a one-on-one negotiation, which right now you can. You know, like whenever someone wants more money, it's like, oh, sorry, you dropped out of the rankings. I don't know what happened there. Nate Diaz, they did that to a while ago. But now Nate Diaz is so popular that he's always in the rankings, even if he's not fought in 2 years. Edgar asks, is there anything to stop more fighters implementing a Rountree Jr.-style sidekick going forward? Is it really that hard to master/pull off regularly? It will be when fighters know how to defend it. In fairness to Rountree, I think that was the first one he threw in the fight, so it worked quite well because the guy didn't know it was coming at all. What I have no sympathy for is guys who just keep plodding onto it, like Rampage and Vitor against John Jones. The low-line side kick, the oblique kick, all those things, anything where you're jamming the lead, like the calf kick as people step in, it's all... Whenever you hear someone say, like, oh, is there any way of stopping that? Is there any way... Why is not everyone using that? think of it exactly the same way as like Anderson Silva counterpunching people. And if people at the time had been like, is there any way to stop a counterpunch? It just seems unfair on the guy who's going to lead. The guy who agrees to throw punches first is inevitably going to get knocked out by the second punch of the fight. So why would anyone bother? We need to ban counterpunches. They're ruining the sport. No, the way you deal with counterpunches is exactly the same way you deal with anything where someone's trying to get hit a target. You fucking move the target around. You pretend you're stepping in when you're not. Then you do step in and you really go for him. You know, you've got to make it hard for them to... Like, if you just keep stepping back into range every time, they know where your lead foot is and your knee is, and they're just going to keep stamping on it. So everyone should be using it until everyone's learned to deal with it. Kyrie asks, how can I be a good analyst like you? I would love to have your eye to have a better appreciation of the sport and to apply it in my training. Thank you, Garry. I tend not to call myself an analyst just because I don't like the formal title of it. But if you want to get better at watching fights, watch fights. Like, that's pretty much all there is to it. And I think it really helps to watch fights. Like, sometimes it's good to have things in mind. Like, Jack Dempsey wrote a How to Watch a Fight piece. I've written some How to Watch Fight pieces. You're looking for the jab. You're looking where the fight's taking place. You're looking if they're by the fence, is the other guy making that happen? Is the guy who's on the inside of the cage taking advantage of that, or is it the guy who is on the fence choosing to go to the fence? There's a lot of reasons that a fight can be taking place in a certain area, and even that, like, dumb accident can play into it. Like, Tyron Woodley could back onto the fence, the other guy could do nothing to cut him off the cage, and then the other guy could knock him out along the fence because Tyron Woodley was stuck on the fence, even though that's where Tyron Woodley wanted to be, or some Tyron Woodley type person. So there's an awful lot going on. But then the other thing is to also watch fights with a willingness to just go like, oh, I'm not quite sure what happened there, and go back and have a look. And then you gradually pick up on things that, particularly the way that these things work, like they trickle through camps, and the coaches are all watching the fights and going, oh, I like that, maybe we steal that. Like the calf kick, one coach saw it, stole it. I say stole it, it's not stealing. One coach saw it, took it, taught all his fighters. Everyone else's coaches saw that happening, and it's all just caught on camp by camp. So watching fights, you can pick up on trends. You can start seeing, like, I can't remember the name for it, when you learn a new word or a concept and suddenly you see it everywhere. It's like that in fighting, but it's assisted by the fact that everyone else is seeing it and all those camps are taking it and doing it. So have your sort of set, like, things that matter, where the fight takes place, who's got the better jab, are they kicking to deal with the jab, who's got the better takedowns, are they able to create clinches, are they lacking a level change, and then look for additional things that you don't consider like the main factors, but they can become bigger factors if more and more people start using them effectively. Sewage Slurper, great name, says, what makes savvy vets so difficult, and what are some of the things to learn from them? People like Francisco Trinaldo, Rafael Assunção, Jim Miller, etc. Bobby Green shoulders bless. And then would you consider doing a series on just savvy vets? I tried to define savviness years and years ago. It's difficult, but the idea of savviness is that just you've seen it a lot. You've seen a lot of this shit, and it's normally old boys, but you get guys who are like young veterans. You get people like Rod Tang, who's like 26 and had 300 fights in Muay Thai. And of course, that's going to have a horrible effect on him later in his life, or he's probably already feeling the effects of that. But he has that, you can't replace rounds with people who are trying to hurt you. Just being calm under fire. And that's really what savviness is. Just like, I've seen this so many times, I basically know what's happening. And also, like, savviness is like having tactics to even out the playing field against younger, more athletic fighters. And it'll change from person to person. Like Francisco Trinaldo, like they've all got their own skill sets. Like Francisco Trinaldo, even though he's 40-something, fantastic banger. He can really like knock people flat, as you saw. He has like Jai Herbert, had Kevin Lee on wobbly legs, gave Paul Felder a terrible time. Like good guys who can take a good shot, and he still blasted them. And he times a really good counter. Not a great combination fighter, but just has that really good counter overhand left. But he also has a very strong clinch game. Again, that's strength. But then the power and the strength are sort of the last things to go a lot of the time. But everyone's got their own things, like a Sun Sao, marvelous control of the distance, limiting the exchanges. Jim Miller just having sort of an all-round game, but being a good grappler. One of the wonderful things about MMA is that because you have so many ways you can take the fight, it's possible to make the fight your own fight a lot more ways, or is it not a lot more ways, but like there are a lot of different opponents who won't have a particular skill where you have particular skills, and you can sort of try and funnel the fight down maybe the only path where you have an advantage. And I think another thing that needs to be explored is like one of the themes of my writing since the very early, like the Killing the King started, has always been take away the person's A game. I think a lot of young fighters or people in the ascendancy are very focused on jamming their A game down the other guy's throat. So you're trying to move someone else into your game. And I think that both ruining like world-class fighters' days and also bringing yourself back into the fight if you've got like physical disadvantages, you're getting older, you're getting more beat up and run down. I think one of the key ways you can do that is not go out and go, what am I best at? But go out and say, what's he best at? And how can I make that really hard? How can I make him hit me with his B game? Because honestly, his B game is probably a lot sloppier. If guys are crushing everyone in the gym with their A game, if they're crushing everyone in fights with their A game, put them on their B game, and it doesn't matter how athletic or an incredible technician they are, they're doing something they're less comfortable with. Something we're always talking about in Killing the King is not always about countering someone's habits, it's about removing their favorite options and making them do something they don't want to do. Because in their head, it's still like, oh, if he stops me from doing this, I'll simply do that. But if people aren't doing that regularly, stopping them doing their A game, they're not nearly as competent doing their B game. Or C game, if you're really good. Let's pop to the YouTube. Jan says, who is your favourite striker and why is it Robert Whittaker? It's tough. Well, someone's replied, I think his favourite is Andy Hug. One of, probably. Yeah, it's tricky. It's tricky whenever you got to do favourites. It's tricky whenever you got to do lists. It's part of why I don't do that stuff. It's just, I don't think I can, I'm not confident even giving my favourite stuff. Because any day I'll be like, do you know what I really love? Jose Napoles. And then I'll forget about him for two weeks. And then I'll go, oh, I fucking love Jose Napoles. There's so many good fighters out there. And there's so many good fighters out there who aren't in that day-to-day top 10 pound for pound ever conversation, and they get pushed by the wayside and you forget about them for a little bit, and then you see him again, you go, God, that guy had a beautiful style. I mean, my favorites, like anyone who listens to the podcast knows that I'll take any excuse to talk about Jersey Joe Walcott, and if you talk about savvy vets, it doesn't get savvier than Jersey Joe Walcott. Andy Hug, obviously. Badr Hari I've been a big fan of, like, even though he's a terrible fucking person, his style was always gorgeous. And it was a fairly late development in his career, too. He was a very kicky, lead-leggy sort of guy in his early career, and then he just learned to bang. Fedor, I mean, no, not as a striker, actually. Probably as an all-round fighter, but strikers, ooh. John Haggerty I'm a big fan of. Muang Thai, not a fighting style I'd recommend to anyone else, but certainly one of a kind. Oh, a very, very squiggly name here. Russian squiggly, not Arabic squiggly, which I'm not going to attempt to read, said, hey Jack, current MMA meta, as far as I see it, is crazy high volumes plus decent boxing, with accent on jab. That's going to be the next big thing, ? All capitalized. I was thinking about Volkanovski and Adesanya's styles of fighting, who are really good at bullshit volume with feints. You don't need to throw 100 punches to land 30, and be in risk of getting hit in return in a firefight, when you can throw 80 feints plus 20 punches, which are going to connect for sure. I guess the first Volkanovski-Holloway fight was a real clash of old versus new metas. Curious to hear your thoughts. From Russian Siberia with love. And then the name, which I can't read. I don't know about that, because if you're saying bullshit volume, if you're saying high volumes and decent boxing with accent on jab, one of the main things from that Volkanovski fight and from the Paulo Costa Adesanya fight is that if you don't know how to jab without taking a low kick, you're going to get low kicked. The feints are to stop. The feints, because people like Volkanovski and Adesanya are in gyms where they're getting low kicked when they're jabbing. If you go out and you just try and jab, you're going to get low kicked to death. Even Stipe, who doesn't low kick, was able to batter Daniel Cormier's lead leg when he jabbed. And in return, neither of those guys good kickers. Both of those guys decent jabbers. Both guys were able to make jabbing hell for the other man by kicking the lead leg. It's tricky because current meta is always going to be like, there are always going to be tons of guys who buck the trend of the meta. And that is what we love about MMA. It's never going to be like everyone has to fight this way, or you're at a disadvantage if you don't fight this way. There's so much going on that you can basically fight however you find best. But you were certainly seeing a trend to more activity and pressure in the last few years. I think it was Dan Martin wrote a piece about it. But I think the thing about feinting and bullshit volume, as you called it, but feinting and activity that isn't all committed, is that you're making stuff happen, you're stopping the opponent from working, which is the entire point of pressure, or that's the value of pressure in the first place. You're making sure you're working and the opponent isn't. If you're feinting effectively and you're keeping them off offense, you're spending a lot less energy to do that, and you're making yourself less of a target in the process. So I don't know if bullshit volume is the future, but people learning to fucking feint is probably the future. Volkanovski versus Holloway is an old versus new. I don't know if that's true either, because like the Holloway that turned up in the first fight was different to the Holloway that turned up in the second fight. I would watch those two fight another 5 times, because it seems like they get a really good read on each other. And Max all week the second time around was like, I haven't looked at the film. I didn't do anything specific for this fight. I just trained and I'm going to go fight him. And then wouldn't you know, he comes out and he's fighting completely differently in all the right ways. So it was all bollocks all the way through. That's an example of lying in the pre-fight convincingly or to a purpose, not like Chuck Liddell and Evander Holyfield on the mitts, where people were like, do you think he's trying to lure him in? You're like, no, I just think he's shit. I think he's absolutely knackered, and he's 60 years old and he can't throw a punch anymore. Oh, here's an interesting in the weeds one. Hugh Janus says, do you think it's easier to be more defensive in the same stance matchup or southpaw versus orthodox? Mayweather does his best work against fellow orthodox fighters, but then you have Petrosian being able to just be evasive in so many open guard matchups. Thanks, Jack, Patreon boys for life. This is interesting. I think it's going to be person to person, but I think in boxing certainly it helps more to be closed stance. So orthodox versus orthodox, because or southpaw versus southpaw, because you can get down behind the lead shoulder, and that lead leg is not an issue. You can stand in the middle of your opponent, so like your knee in their center line / ball line, your knee up their taint. You can stand like bisecting them with your shoulder line down your lead hip, and make sure that everything from their right hand is hitting your back, and everything from their lead hand you can pick off with your right hand, and then you're just shooting jabs down the middle. That's the ideal of boxing. Doesn't work the moment you can kick that lead leg, because as soon as you start putting your foot in the middle, the other guy's going to start punting it in. Whereas in an southpaw versus orthodox matchup, an open stance or open guard affair, the distance tends to be, you can make it longer, and if kicks are viable or legal in your sport, you can insist on it being a longer range. You can basically take the hands out of the game by checking their lead hand with your lead hand, keeping your other hand high, and then maintaining the distance so that they have to really step in to throw their rear hand. I mean, we're talking about it with AJ McKee versus Pitbull. If you fight southpaw against Pitbull, his best weapon is his left hook, and you have to be on top of him for that. If he's going to throw his right hand at you, he's got to lunge a long way because he's so much shorter, and you can just throw in kicks all day. So I think for complete fighting, I would say an open guard matchup is favourable, and that's something that I've always enjoyed doing. I call it like mirror manning, or just getting, because if you're in open stance situation, that's like looking in a mirror. If you are shadow boxing against a mirror, you're always boxing if you're orthodox, you're always boxing against a southpaw. You can't do open matchup against a mirror. You can't do a closed stance matchup against a mirror. So I always think of it as mirroring, like get on the same stance or get on the opposite stance to them, be the mirror, and just pat off all their weapons and dig in the odd kick. But then I always had trouble with southpaws who have good jabs, so I would then switch to southpaw and try and do it, do a closed guard matchup against them. So I think that's the thing about switch hitting, which is a real trend you're seeing in MMA over the last few years. I think the thing about switch hitting is that you're always going to have to work to whatever you're comfortable doing or where you feel comfortable, rather than saying, well, I should be able to do this and I should be able to do that, because you just can't build two-rounded games. You cannot build a game where it's not even two-rounded games, because if you're a one-stance fighter, you have to build a game versus an orthodox and a southpaw opponent, so you've got two games off that stance. If you're a two-stance fighter, you've got to have four options, because it's got to be whatever the opponent does as well. And that's why we're always saying, when both guys are switching, it's a mess. The fight becomes a mess. If you switch with a switch hitter, their life gets a lot harder. Energy Potato 12 says, you often talk about the two best ways of fighting a tall opponent, one being to pressure them, and the other being to stay just outside of range and attack after they do. Obviously, the two methods can't be applied at the exact same moment, but I'm curious as to if they can complement each other, and if so, how? Do you have any examples of fighters who consistently use both strategies, whether it be both strategies in the same fight or separately? Shit, I'm going to have to think about good examples of both, but no, you could definitely use both. Like, it's once you see a fighter get into like a flow, when they've got a good, I want to say, read on the opponent, because it's very hard to read someone and actually, it's reading tea leaves. You don't actually know if they're going to do something. You have a hunch and you go on it. But when you see someone really get into the flow of that, where they like crowd someone and then they'll step back and then the other guy will come in and they'll go over the top. I mean, a really good example of, not against a tall guy, but just sort of like this sort of, I don't want to say flow state because I hate people to say flow state, but this sort of flow state is like Dominic Cruz versus TJ Dillashaw. He'd go backwards, and then he'd come forwards. Or actually Garbrandt versus Cruz. He'd go backwards, draw Cruz in, and then he'd go forwards when he felt like he could push the advantage. You've got to have the multiple modes and be able to read when one's going to work and when the other is. And you've got to have the confidence that if you fuck it up, you can just reset. I think, just retired the other day, but Manny Pacquiao's a nice example, because a lot of his work was two-handed hitting, which is very hard to do if you're so much shorter and your arms are so much shorter. If you're going to do two-handed hitting, you really need to get quite close to do it, mid-range. He wasn't like a Henry Armstrong-style forehead on chest in-fighter, but he was a mid-range, an exchanging range fighter. But he also hit a lot of nice counters by drawing people on. If you watch the Margarito fight, which I think is one of his best, it goes between him stepping in and overwhelming Margarito and then circling off and having Margarito reach for him and then him landing a good counter over the top and then going back and crowding him. It's turning one thing into the other, disengaging, letting the guy come in. And it's that balancing between, like, if you're crowding the guy, you can really beat him up, and actually get going as the shorter fighter. But he might cover up and not give you the same openings. Think of like Joshua Clottey versus Pacquiao. Basically just covered up for the whole fight. And in taking a step back and letting the guy swing at you, you're getting more out of it by having him open up for the counter. So you really do have to be able to you have to be able to read when, like, it's time to take your foot off the gas and let the other guy back into it. It comes back to that quote that I always talk about, Shigeru Igami, who was this really weird mystic karate guy. Not a legit fighter at all, but great quote. He used to say that, like, don't think of fighting as a confrontation. Think of it as a relationship between two people. And I think once you get to a very good level, you have to think about that. It's true with like grappling and things like that. You give guys something so that you can take more back. The like, I've got to keep on offense so that he can't get anything going is a very it's almost like a scared way to fight. It's like, I can't let him back into it. Whereas once you start to know more and you've got more comfort, you can go like, I think it'd probably help me here if he did open up a bit. Smash says, what would you tell Evander Holyfield if he was your granddad? I've gotten a reply from a question from the Weasel and Viras Zahavi. Now I just need Jack Slack for the trifecta and the greatest accomplishment of my online career. I swear I've answered a Smash question before. But if Evander Holyfield were my granddad, I'd tell him stop fucking around. I'd be like, do you want to be a great granddad? I'd like you still here. I mean, Evander Holyfield's living a pretty good life anyway. He's yes, he used to be worth like 200 million. He's now worth like 1 million. But he was banging Louisa Zisman. He's still in great shape for a 60-year-old. I just, it's this thing, and it does happen with other sports. Just these people who are like, I'm convinced I can still go, and you're like, just don't. Just be the guy in the gym where people go, Jesus, is he 60? Don't be the guy who's in the ring going, would you believe I'm 60? And then just getting sparked. Be a hot granddad. Don't be, a mess. And in fairness, I think part of that is probably because Evander, his hanging around too long really wasn't that bad. Like, every boxer or fighter has to hang around too long and get the shit kicked out of them. And some of them it takes forever, like Diego Sanchez. And it really doesn't help if they win one after like 10 losses because they go, I've worked it out now. I just needed the right life coach or whatever. But Evander, he was in title contention fighting Valuev for his belt at the age of like 46. And I don't recall him getting sparked that badly. Like at the end of that comeback, I think he just didn't get the title and he was like, fuck it, I'm not doing this anymore. So he came back this time, got badly beaten. And it's kind of, it is, how many times do we have to teach you this lesson, old man? That is boxing and fighting in a nutshell. Zane says, what do you think about improvements made to Usman's striking? Would you consider him a high-level striker? Yeah, within MMA. I mean, I think we're always limited by these, like, trying to define what a high-level striker is. And you're like, yes, he's knocking people out with his hands, but is he really a high-level striker, or is it because of the wrestling? And you're like, it's MMA. It doesn't matter. If he's knocking people out with his hands in MMA, he's doing well striking. I would say he's applying the jab wonderfully, and it is the soundboard of my podcast is just me saying, uses the jab, which not many people in MMA do, but he does use the jab off both stances, which not many people in MMA do. Like Gane is doing it very successfully. I'll think of another one day, I'm sure, but I think he's got a high level problem for people, is what I describe it as, because that really is all high-level striking needs to be. Sammy Schilt wasn't a great counter or ring general, but Sammy Schilt had 2 questions that people couldn't deal with. Well, 3 questions. He had the front kick, the jab, or the front kick that turned into a high kick occasionally, but he had the front kick, the jab, and then if you got too close, he'd just pull your head down and knee you. And if you don't have an answer for those 3 things, it doesn't matter that he only does 3 things. So high-level striker is very subjective, but I'm fine saying he is. Yeah, why not? Does that mean that he won't get outstruck by someone? Does that mean that someone won't come along and show a very obvious glaring hole in his boxing or kickboxing that you wouldn't get to a high level to kickboxing having? No, but he's got an awful lot else going on. If you're only training for boxing, there are 4 punches the opponent can hit you with, and you're going to learn quite quickly to deal with every single one of them. Whereas in MMA, a guy can come out and dive a low single on you, and you haven't seen it in like 5 years. You're like, no one's done that to me since a grappling tournament in 2015. Clyde says, would love to hear your thoughts on Nate versus Dustin. I know it makes no sense instead of going for the belt, but it has potential for a good build-up and a great stylistic matchup. Keep up the great work, mate. Dustin would be stupid not to low kick him to death. And Dustin isn't stupid. Like, Dustin, I mean, if anything you've taken away from these McGregor fights, from the Gaethje fight, it's that, yes, he's a banger. Yes, he has a great chin. Yes, he gets into wars, but overwhelmingly, he wins those bouts by doing the right things in between the sort of like scrappy exchanges. I mean, it could be fun, but I think Dustin is at the point where he's about to, like, he's going to level off at some point and start declining because of his age and the number of fights he's been in, the hardness of those fights. And I think, it's interesting. MMA fighting, their rankings, which I slagged off the other week because their pound-for-pound rankings are just awful. But a lot of them ranked Dustin Poirier above Charles Oliveira, which is interesting because, like, people were like, you can't do that. Charles Oliveira is the champion. And then in one breath, you're like, yeah, okay. But then you're also like, well, no, the title's made up. The old titles used to just be like whoever the press agreed was the best fighter in the world because we didn't have belts. And if Dustin Poirier has fought better opponents and beaten them and on a better run and just wasn't in the right place at the right time to get the belt, why not rank him as the number 1 in the world if you think he is? But that Oliveira versus Poirier fight is such a tasty matchup. And I think they have actually put this together now, but I just, that this is the thing. Dustin Poirier can have a good fight against anyone. And I'm sure Nate Diaz can too, but Nate Diaz is such a flawed fighter that he won't get into the title picture unless he's given a lot of help. But I think Dustin Poirier can have a great match with either of those two. I just think it's probably probably promotionally, it's more important to have him do it against Nate, or would be easy money to have him do it against Nate. But I think he's also a star in his own right, and I think it would do more for the sport, and I think it'd be better as a spectacle to have him fight Charles Oliveira. I don't think he'll get the same build-up. Charles Oliveira is nowhere near the star that Nate Diaz is, and certainly he's not tried to be. He's not like a big talker or anything like that. But I think that's the one, like... It's interesting, because I think if you've got a matchup where you can tell people, like, these guys don't talk a lot of shit, they're not social media superstars, but they are the best in the world, and they're two of the most exciting fighters to ever do it. I think this is a great fight to break through to people who don't care about people who aren't Nate Diaz or Conor McGregor or Jorge Masvidal. Hamburgernator, great name, says, Garry Tonon is fighting Thanh Le for the one belt. What are your thoughts on this matchup? Do you know what? I think that's great. I think that's it's a fun one because Garry Tonon has been really making a good faith effort with his striking. But Thanh Le is the kind of guy who could very quickly make you regret fucking around too long on the feet with him. I think that any successful Garry Tonon game plan does have an element of standing with Thanh Le, but you know, one of the wonderful things about Tonon is that he's adapted his grappling so well for MMA, and that is it's still a bit of an enigma. It's still a bit of an enigma how to do that, because guys who do it well aren't always the best in grappling, and the best guys in grappling sometimes can't do it, and it doesn't always make sense either, because Yuri Simosh, you know, barely plays guard. Won a load of ADCC and Nogi titles by being a great takedown artist, despite not having like a wrestling background, being a good, a great jiu-jitsu player, but having these takedowns. And I was like, well, that seems like the right sort of base for MMA, you know. And I think he's got a win over Gordon Ryan. Oh no, that's Vinny. But yeah, it's you were like, that's a great base for MMA. Comes out against a guy no one's ever heard of in his one debut. Can't get him off his feet. And I think a lot of that was the fact that it's fence wrestling. You know, it is a completely different sport. But then the rumor was like, you know, even Gordon Ryan, who grew up boxing and then switched to BJJ, he can't get it going together in the gym. You know, I think that's the reason him and Keenan are beefing, because Keenan revealed it like, on a podcast by accident. But yeah, apparently they just weren't happy with how slowly he was coming along when he was talking about doing an MMA fight. And now he's retired because no one wears flip-flops at Henzo's, so he's had so many staph infections and taken so many antibiotics that it's destroyed his stomach biome. Dudes just going to the toilet in their bare feet. That makes me physically sick, that thought. Okay. But yes, Garry Tonon versus Thanh Le is about the best fight you can put on if you won. Here's a couple from Facebook then. Billy says, when people miss weight, should they have to fight up a weight class? Would this fix the weight cutting issue, or at least disincentivize people from missing weight? Yeah, this is an organizational decision. You know, the UFC can say, like, we are not offering you any more fights at what was it they did to Kelvin Gastelum? We're not offering you any more fights at welterweight, and they did this to Johnny Hendricks too, until you prove that you can make it, because we're going to do, you're going to do middleweight fights until you have sorted your nutrition and taken care of yourself. I don't know the contractual legalities of that. You might not be able to do it. You might, in the original contract, it might say that they have to offer you X number of fights at this weight per year. But it would work well, I think. It would work well in some cases. Like, guys who are obviously going to get themselves really hurt by, like I think Rumble Johnson would have died if he kept going to kept trying to go to 170. But there's those guys who you definitely want to discourage from cutting so much weight. But also, there are cases where guys would just miss weight and ditch 20% of their purse to kick the shit out of someone. Think of Alex Oliveira versus Will Brooks. He came in 7 pounds heavy. There's no way. That's also 7 pounds heavy. Well, there's two ways you can do it. That's 7 pounds heavy where you didn't even try. So you didn't do a weight cut. You were just like, I'm going to come in 7 pounds heavy. Fuck him. So you're not like diminishing yourself before the fight. But there's also people who will cut weight and still come in 5 pounds heavy. And you're going, well, 5 pounds rehydrated is like the best part of 20 pounds. So yeah, you really do want to discourage that sort of shit. And again, it's tricky because like it shouldn't be a case of having to reach into fighters' wallets and go like, no, you're not having your money. You're not having the agreed upon amount of money. But, this is a dangerous game. Anything outside the parameters of the contract should be seen as assault. If you get caught using drugs when you said you wouldn't, that should be assault. If you hit someone on the fucking weigh-in stage instead of in the ring, that's assault. It's not quite as bad as it was 15 years ago where we were like, we're inches from this being illegal if you don't stop fucking around. But it's always pretty bad. Just watching people take stupid risks that will probably hurt the whole sport more than just them if they fuck it up. Gulliver says, why are some fighters not able to work on and improve obvious weaknesses? Brackets JDS ringcraft, Woodley combinations, Nate leg kicks, and following opponents. Well, it could be a number of things. Like, I don't know their specific cases, but it can be that their coach won't notice it or isn't equipped to deal with it. With JDS, he's been with, is it Durea? He's been here with him forever. And Nate Diaz and Nick Diaz have been with Richard Perez forever. And Woodley's been with Dean Thomas forever. But then I don't think Dean Thomas is doing his striking training. But yes, it could be you need to change a coach. It could be the coach not seeing something. It could be that in one aspect you were just uncoachable. There are things like, I'm sure everyone at some point in their life has been like, I'm going to get really good at playing the guitar, and then girls won't be able to resist me. And then found out that, oh no, for me, like, it's not that you're always going to be shit. It's that for me, this is going to be a lot of practice. Because there are people who can just take something up and it just clicks for them, and they're the Jimi Hendrixes, the Gordon Ryans of the world, where like if they do pour in those hours, they're going to be astronomically better than anyone else, and if they don't pour in those hours, they'll still be pretty good, and it'll be really annoying. But on the opposite end of that, like, for as good as JDS's hands might be, for as good as those setups that he worked out might be, he just can't work out the ringcraft. It might take him hours and hours and hours. It might take him it might take him that mythical 10,000 hours. But that should have been something that his coach had him working every single day, because they realized it was, or they should have realized it was such a weakness. And it can also be, like, moving on to Nate and Nick, it can also be that the way that you fight is the only way you know how, or is the way that you know how to fight. And it leaves you wide open for the low kicks. That lead leg pointing in, jabbing slowly inwards towards people, walking them to the fence. It might be the only way you know how to fight. And to start addressing it properly, you would need to change the way you fight fundamentally, and you're not confident doing that. So there's a lot of reasons. Like, and I think that's the other thing. Like, for every time I hear like Joe Rogan talking about how a jiu-jitsu black belt should be able to become a great striker because they just apply the same work ethic, and you're like, well, yes, he could apply the same work ethic, but he just could not be good at learning how to strike. He could just have no natural aptitude for it. We've all watched Damian Maia. He put a lot of time into his striking. He became an okay striker, but he was putting so much time into it that it was working to the detriment of the rest of his game. I think it's very hard for people to accept that, like, no, world champions are not just like amazing work ethic. there's natural talent going in there too. You cannot just, like, there are going to be elements of even the same part, like the same sport, that you just can't work out in the same way that like everything else clicked together for you. Peter says, what's with fighters getting their own name tattooed on their body? Is it in case the CTE makes them forget? Waking up with John D. raped and killed my wife across your chest. Honestly, I think it's to do with being recognizable. And whenever people say like, oh, you complain about shorts too much or whatever, or fighters having their own sponsors, being recognizable is a huge, like, I don't understand how people can in the same breath be like, no, fighters should have to wear a uniform. And also like, well, it's not on the promoter to make you break through as a fighter. You should be able to do it yourself. Like, how are they going to do that if they don't have a recognizable look? It's crazy because we all remember Chuck Liddell's shorts. We all remember Krokop's shorts. We all remember Anderson Silva's shorts. And the moment that Conor McGregor became world champion, they made a new colour short for him to make him recognisable from other fighters. Like, that was during the Reebok deal. They were like, yeah, we should make him some green shorts. But yes, dudes get their own name tattooed on the back because like they want to be seen on TV and people know who they are. Angus says, Brad Riddell versus Rafael Fiziev has been booked. Thoughts and excitement level? Excitement level high, because they were both coaches at the same gym, so they've probably banged it out a fair amount. So yeah, you're going to see not only two guys who are very slick strikers, but two guys who know each other and also know that the other guy knows them. Ian says, would you rather gain 300 pounds but be better than Gordon Ryan is at jiu-jitsu, or be 5 feet tall but have Izzy's level of striking? Oh man, that's tricky. Well, see, now the 300 pounds, in my head, I'm like, yeah, I'd gain 300 pounds to be as good as Gordon Ryan, but then it's like 300 pounds would also be like opting into a heart attack in 5 years' time. Yeah, Izzy's level of striking at 5 feet tall. I'll just fight in the one strawweight men's division. I'll just slap the shit out of Joshua Pacquiao. And to be honest, he's mainly a striker too, so I'd just like touch his legs and he'd fall over. Sit on top of him with my Izzy level striking. Back to Twitter. All Whitakers asks, how do fighters train to gradually build through their fights, such as Max Holloway or Petr Yan? Is it an instinctual aspect of their fighting styles, just natural progression of the fight, or something that is trained? I think probably just a huge amount of cardio work, and also a natural aptitude for cardio heavy activities. And then, the way that it's like that sort of thing that we all recognize, like it starts as a trickle and then it progresses. I think that's just partly due to the conditioning, but also due to confidence. I think if people like Max Holloway are fairly intelligent fighters, and they're not going to run out there and try and like swarm on a guy in round one and get countered. You see Holloway step it up more and more as he feels his opponent can't effectively hit back at him. And that's where the cardio really helps, because as the guy he is fighting gets more tired, because he's digging body shots, he's jabbing them, he's landing counters, they become more and more shelled up, and he can get away with more and pour it on. I don't think it's that he's training to do more each round. I think it's that he's training to do a lot all the time, and then just the way the fight progresses is why it comes out more each round. He doesn't start the fights at 1,000,000 miles an hour. Same with Petr Yan. You watch his early work, and there's an awful lot of like sort of cutting the cage but not committing to anything for the early going. Like the first round of Petr Yan's fights can be quite dull, and then it just starts to build, and suddenly you're in the fourth round going, God, this pace is inscrutable. There's pressure, and you forget like the first round he really didn't do much. So it comes on pretty quick once he starts. But yeah, I don't know if it's something you train for. I think it's something. If they're training something, I imagine it's to put out a high output every round, and then the actual person standing in front of them is making it so that they're not doing that in the early rounds, rather than they're building up to a big round as a choice. Zachary Makovsky of the UFC's flyweight division, and is he PFL now? He asks, how can we hasten the YouTubers and elderly takeover of fight sports? Of all sports. Juji Snatcher, spelled in elite, has several questions. What do you think the next phases of MMA grappling and striking will be? Thoughts on Buchecha's one debut? Is Mica Galvao the next GOAT in Jiu-Jitsu? What does Tom Aspinall need to do to improve to become a top 5 heavyweight? And who would you say are the best shoot boxers in MMA currently? God, we're getting inside baseball there. Inside Danaher terms. Next phases of MMA grappling and striking. Oh, I don't know. I don't know. Honestly, I think we're going to start retreading. You're not going to see so many new techniques now. Like, when no one was kicking with the ball of the foot to the body, when no one was throwing the calf kick. I think you're probably going to see things like the left hook, which, again, like that's been in MMA since day one. But when you see it done well, like Vicente Luque's doing, it's a completely different technique to what most people are doing with their left hook. Thoughts on Buchecha's debut in one? I mean, I feel the same about that as I did about Yuri Samosh. I'm just cautiously excited now, but it's one, so like the build-up will probably take forever. Mica Galvao, I haven't even watched yet, so I'm going to have to check him out. Tom Aspinall, what does he need to do to become a top 5? I don't think he needs to improve anything. I think he just needs to beat the right person. You know, in the top 5 at any time, there's always a couple of bums because there are only 3 good heavyweights in the world at any time. But he does seem to be content on taking it slow, which fine, I respect that. You know, it seems to be like a heavyweight thing. You come in as a young prospect, they put you against some 40-year-old you're supposed to blow through, and you lose somehow, and then you have to build up. And by the time you're 40, you're suddenly a contender. And then who would you say are the best shoot boxers in MMA currently? Man, I can't even think. I mean, probably TJ Dillashaw. I'm just trying to think of guys who box into their takedowns well. You know, not even Usman. You know, his is like jab and then lean over and try and snatch single. Weidman used to be quite good at that sort of thing. Dvalishvili is pretty good at mixing his boxing into takedowns. And to be honest, you know, as much as he doesn't have the wrestling pedigree, Petr Yan loves a takedown and he boxes into them very well. Chris asks, you mentioned that you thought Till's performance against Brunson was pretty brave, as most of Till's career had been as a bully. Can you think of other fights where a fighter seen as a bully had a really gutsy performance? Not off the top of my head. I mean, there's been a few. Like, you know, people. If you're just murdering people and you don't meet a lot of resistance, everyone expects you to crumble when you get hit, and it doesn't always happen. Like, you know, some of Mike Tyson's ones, once he'd met real opposition, were quite courageous. You know, he was getting hurt and he just kept going. But one of the ones that I always think about, like when I'm thinking about like the difference between a bully and, you know, bullying is a fighting style, but like a bully as a mindset is like you fight well until the guy fights back, and then you're like, oh, it's not worth it. I don't want to do this anymore. A good example for me would be someone like George Foreman, and especially his transformation from young Foreman to old Foreman, because by the time that he was an old man, he was getting hit a lot, and by people like Evander Holyfield. Like, there's a clip of Holyfield landing 8 punches, like no full load up and no break, just landing flush on George Foreman at age 43, I think he was at the time, and Foreman just takes him, and then he keeps going. And like that Holyfield fight is quite courageous because he can't catch up to Holyfield at all, but he just keeps going. And then at the end, he just says to his corner that he's blown it, and you're like, oh, that's really sad. And then fortunately, he met Mora after that. He got another shot and was able to make it happen. But you know, the maturity between young Foreman and old Foreman is astonishing. And I know that his sort of like religious conversion had a lot to do with that. You know, he would say, but like when you watch young Foreman, I think it's something that it happens gradually. Like once you start overwhelming people, you're surprised when people start coming back at you. Because he must have been in like brawls in his early amateur days. But when you watch like the Ron Lyle fight and Ron Lyle comes back at him, Foreman just goes crazy. He's like, he's almost offended this guy's throwing back at him. But then when you watch his late career, he's just so methodical, and he expects these younger, faster heavyweights to hit him, and he's just like, yeah, I'll get him. I'll get him in a couple of rounds. You know? Actually, one that like shut me up a bit, or changed my mind about someone, was the Anthony Joshua Klitschko fight. Because, and to be honest, I had a little bit of a change of opinion about both of them. Because Klitschko had always been seen as this clean technician. Didn't like it when people got in his face. You know, he liked to box, and then he'd crumble if you did manage to crack him. But you probably wouldn't, because he's just so technical, and also really likes clinching and making fights boring. And then Anthony Joshua had been fed up on like not an awful lot of great talent. He'd fought Dillian White before then, but like he'd been brought up, you know, with the intention of not letting him lose and then fighting for a world title. And you know, we were all very skeptical because he'd just sort of blown through people. But not only did you get a gutsy as hell performance out of Klitschko, you got a gutsy as hell performance out of Joshua. And I think that fight was, it made me reassess my opinion of both men. And I thought it was just a wonderful fight all round. Will asks, why is the uppercut so underutilized? Is it underutilized or is it overused when it's not the right time for it? We were talking about this last week with Anderson Silva, Julio Cesar Chavez. I was saying like Anderson Silva was hitting him with uppercuts all day. And that's something we didn't see an awful lot of from Anderson Silva in the ring, because there's not an awful lot, in the cage, because there's not an awful lot of opportunities for it where something else wouldn't work better. The uppercut is very much for a bent forward opponent. And every degree that they're standing more upright is more chance for you missing with the uppercut. And missed uppercuts are big openings. Like, there is a big chance to get hit with a counterpunch. But then you can, like, kickboxing is a very upright sport, and some of the best body hitters in kickboxing use the uppercut, and low kickers use the uppercut to make the opponent stay upright. It's almost like, stay there, you just sort of whiff in front of their face, and then you dig a left hook to the liver or a right low kick. I think that's probably Nicky Holzken's best combo, the right uppercut, left hook to the liver. And that's, that's a combination where I suppose it's more a setup, because it's never going to happen that both punches land. The point is that the uppercut comes up and makes the opponent stay upright so that you can hit him in the liver. But uppercuts in MMA, I mean, the uppercut in MMA, like, you have an opportunity to really land it well with the single collar tie. I really do wish more people dirty boxed effectively along the fence. But generally, like, the way to land uppercuts is to get people bending forward. And the way to do that is, like, the Chad Mendes go for a leg or establish the body jab. Jack asks, I was wondering how you feel about Tom Aspinall. Could he beat Cyril Gane? I don't know, but that's basically, like, aside from Gane and Ngannou, Aspinall versus Gane is probably, like, the most interesting fight. I'm going to be careful, because I said Rosenstruck versus Gane. That should be a banger. Famous last words. But no, I'd really like to see those two match up their striking chops. Anders asks, whatever happened to Neo footwork? It just became footwork. Josh says, would you beat Gegard Mousasi in a fight? Oh, no. Oh, no, sorry, he said street fight. Yes. Oh, I'd kick his ass. Div asks, I had a couple like this. Are the alarmingly reactionary politics of some fighters one of the major obstacles in the way of them unionizing? And then someone else on YouTube asked, why is the MMA community so prone to being right-wing fascists? In terms of fighters, there's a difference between being, like, regular right-wing and full-on fash, but I think the reason that some of them are so, like, into strongmen is that, if you value masculinity as a quality, you're going to want to see it everywhere. A man with a hammer sees every problem as a nail. I think, like most of the things that are wrong with the world, I think the two-party system and the culture war are to blame. Like, you cannot have nuanced opinions on anything. Like, if there's one subject that you know a lot about, so you have a strong opinion on it, you have the rest of your views assigned to you, because, like, that's the only way you can vote. But it's things like this, like the fighters unionizing, that I just cannot get my head around. Fighters being like, oh no, trade unions are bad, associations are bad, blah, 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 because I've been told. And this is crazy, because, like, the parties believed different things like 20, 30 years ago. They've both rebranded since then. But put it this way, me and Tim Kennedy don't have an awful lot in common. But me and Tim Kennedy both also think that the best way to get fighters paid and looked after, because it's not just the fighter pay that's an issue, it's that major sporting bodies are able to do incredibly shady practices to pressure fighters into doing things. We were talking about with interim titles. We were talking about, because, like, it's the whole promise has been like, yeah, well, you'll get money if you really do become a star, if you're worth it. If you knock out everyone you fight and become an internet sensation, then you'll be okay. And you're like, well, Francis Ngannou did that, and he's still being stiffed by the UFC. So it's more than just the fighter pay that's an issue here. It's you need a body of fighters or people who have that fighter's interests at heart, making sure that this isn't just a one-way abusive relationship. But yes, I think there is some growing up that needs to be done by many fighters to realize that, like, getting together to try and be treated with some dignity and be paid a little bit more of what you're worth is not asking to create a UFC Soviet and give all power to them. And on the other hand, I think people need to accept that, like, if you have very strong views about gays or religion or whatever else you don't like people having strong views about, you still need to get them on side to get the fucking fighters paid more. And I had a few questions about that trans fighter today too, and my answer to all of those is, like, I don't have a strong opinion because I don't know enough about it. Because, like, I feel like I should be allowed to be like, yeah, people can live however they want. Of course, there are people who don't feel comfortable in their own bodies, and they should be allowed. Like, we live in a modern world where it's possible to make life a bit better for them. but also be like, I don't know if that gives someone an advantage when they go into MMA. Probably some studies need to be done in it. It's like the Laurel Hubbard in the Olympics thing, where I'm supposed to have a strong view on it, and I don't know anything about it. Let's do some fun ones again, because that was getting depressing. Dan says, do you think there's any practical use to capoeira in MMA? Or are my dreams of an Eddie Gordo champion doomed to failure? Yes, I do. There was a lad called Marcus Aurelio, not the guy who beat Takanori Gomi once, but Brazilian capoeirista, and he had some spectacular knockouts. There is sort of like a value to it being, you can chain together a series of moves where, like, if the guy steps in, firstly, it's stuff that he hasn't really seen before, but if he steps in while you're spinning 3 times, there's a good chance he gets clapped over the head and gets knocked out. But more than that, I think there's a good value in the Jinga, which is, isn't that far removed from watching, like, Willie Pep, Dominic Cruz, Muhammad Ali, people who abandon their stance but continue a rhythmic movement. Not far removed from the Jinga. And the Jinga is something you can look up online, and to be honest, you can teach yourself to do very, very quickly. And then if you can teach yourself to attack off both stances in, like, kickboxing combinations from there, you've got yourself a new secret technique. Right, I reckon that'll do us for today. I'm going to be back on Wednesday, Thursday with the Boycast to talk about the fights going on at the weekend. Next week, we've got Usyk versus Joshua, which will be very fun. And probably I'm going to write something in between too. I'm looking at, at the moment I'm studying the Korean Zombie Ortega tape and trying to work out, is Ortega that much better, or did Korean Zombie just not do anything? And talking about, like, how much can you actually learn from one fight? Because there's been a couple like this where a guy has had one really good fight and everyone's like, damn, talking about Derek Brunson versus Edmund Shabazian, we're like, damn, he's fixed everything. And then it just comes out he's not anything like that in his next few fights. But yes, we'll be doing something Ortega, Korean Zombie in advance of the UFC pay-per-view. So if you want to support the podcast, get in on the Boycast, read all the stuff I'm writing, sign up to the Patreon, become a boy. If you want to send an email to the podcast, jackslackpodcast@gmail.com. And if you want to see what I'm writing anytime, fightprimer.com. I am your boy, Jack Slack. All power to the fighters, Soviet bless.